Hey, everybody. It is Tuesday, June 25th. You're listening to the Mo.news podcast. I'm mo.news.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. Jill is on location today as she records the podcast.
Yes, and that location would be my in-laws' house, about 10 minutes from my house, as my internet is spotty.
Yes, Jill, we thought we had that resolved, or we thought that your local telecom had that resolved last year. And what the listeners don't know is that we sometimes go through quite the roller coaster ride when it comes to internet signal and getting this podcast together.
Yes, Moshe. So I had a little bit of satisfaction, or I just felt at least not quite as bad when you were in Chicago recently and you were staying at a hotel and your internet was not great and it kept going down. And I'm like, I just tried to be so understanding about it because I was like, don't worry about it. We got this. We'll keep recording. No big deal.
Jill, it's notable, we're still getting the tech house in order globally, locally, in this country, because today, June 25th, is known as Global Beatles Day, as in the music group, because it marks on this day, June 25th, 1967, the group performed All You Need Is Love to 400 million people around the world via the first global live TV link that broadcast to 26 countries around the world. So the Beatles had that huge moment back in the late 60s. The internet would come around. We're still figuring it all out. We're trying to connect. We're just a few miles away from one another.
Well, speaking of millions of miles, let's get to some headlines. 2 NASA astronauts are stuck in space, and it is unclear when they're going to be able to come home because of issues on their Boeing spacecraft. Speaking of Boeing, the Justice Department is weighing criminal charges against the company for violating an agreement after the deadly 737 MAX crashes a few years back. And as we await major Supreme Court rulings this week, we're also learning that the court will take up a major transgender case in next year's term.
Yeah, the court's been avoiding several cases related to this, but it's gotten to the point where the Supreme Court is going to be taking up transgender rights. We'll tell you about it.
The extreme weather continues. A dam in Minnesota being overrun by floodwaters. Local authorities are calling for evacuations. Overseas, Islamic terrorists kill at least 20 people in a Russian province as officials around Putin are trying to blame NATO and Ukraine.
As they do.
The cybercrime gang that took down thousands of car dealerships appears to be getting paid a ransom to let them back online. And that was quick. The governor of Louisiana said bring it on when it came to lawsuits over the state requiring public schools to display the 10 Commandments. And now the ACLU is taking Louisiana to court. And Americans have been trimming their spending, but there are some cheap steakhouses that are apparently booming. And Moshe is on this day in history, besides the Beatles.
Yeah, we gave you a little bit of on this day in history at the top. Jill will tell you the story behind one of the most iconic flags in the world. It was revealed on this day in history.
All right, stuck in space. The 2 NASA astronauts who flew Boeing's Starliner capsule to the International Space Station earlier this month have stayed in orbit much longer than anticipated and will continue to do so. The original plan for this first crewed test flight of the Starliner had called for the astronauts, Butch Wilmore and Sunita Williams, to spend about a week on the space station before riding that capsule back to Earth. Well, if you remember, they arrived at the orbiting outpost on June 6th, and they are now going on nearly 3 weeks, and it is unclear when they'll be able to come home. Their return journey has been postponed several times. NASA initially floated June 18th as the earliest date that the astronauts could return, and then the agency said the flight back would happen on June 22nd. That was then changed to June 26th, and now the latest is a TBD, undetermined new date.
So, Jill, it's what the NASA astronauts share with us at an airport, where you keep saying delay board, and you're like, we don't know when your flight's going to take off.
I am having so much anxiety even reading this story because I get anxiety if my flight is delayed, to your point.
Yeah.
And at least then it's at the very least you could rent a car and drive home.
Or stay in a hotel. Yeah.
And this was their only way out. NASA has said the reason for the adjustments, nice word, is an investigation into issues with the capsule that cropped up earlier in the flight. The Boeing spacecraft's propulsion system has a slow helium leak. It's something that mission managers knew about prior to the launch, but at the time they said that it was unlikely to affect the test flight or the safety of the astronauts. However, 4 additional helium leaks were detected once the spacecraft reached orbit.
Yes, and as the Boeing Starliner craft neared the space station back on June 6th, 5 of its thrusters also malfunctioned, delaying the final approach by just over an hour. And so a lot of issues here that NASA and Boeing say they are monitoring. Despite the issues, NASA says it still has confidence in the Starliner. They say the spacecraft is performing well in orbit while docked in the space station, besides the whole helium leak issue that's delaying the return of the 2 astronauts. Now, this was a big deal. Boeing Starliner, years behind schedule, finally gets off the ground earlier this month. And this is meant to show that Boeing, the Starliner, is going to be able to ferry astronauts back and forth into low Earth orbit and be part of NASA's future here. And so after being years behind schedule, going over budget, et cetera, it finally lives off on June 5th. And now all these issues. So NASA officials have suggested in a blog post, there is no date for when the astronauts can return. There is going to be a major spacewalk on July 2nd. So they're thinking after July 2nd. Now, not to be worried. There are enough supplies in space to accommodate the 2 of them, and there's no need to hurry the departure. In fact, they are currently living on the space station with 7 other crew members who are already stationed on the space station. Apparently, according to reports, they're helping out with a whole number of tasks while they're up there. They're carrying out other tests as part of NASA's process. They were only going to be there for a week. Now they're there for several weeks, so they're volunteering. They're assisting their fellow astronauts up there. NASA says it will conduct a full review, though, before giving the go-ahead to get back in the Starliner and return back to Earth.
And it comes as we're following another Boeing story back here on Earth. And this is completely separate, but it does point to just how important this mission with NASA was for Boeing to have good publicity. Federal prosecutors are recommending that the Justice Department file criminal charges against Boeing, again, totally unrelated to the Starliner. Boeing is accused of violating the terms of a settlement related to those fatal 737 MAX crashes in 2018 and 2019 that killed 346 people. Under a 2021 deal, the Justice Department agreed not to prosecute Boeing over allegations that it defrauded the FAA. So as long as the company overhauled its compliance practices and submitted regular reports. Boeing also agreed to pay $2.5 billion to settle the investigation. And it appears based on these reports that they may not have met those requirements, according to federal prosecutors.
Yeah, so criminal charges could be in store for Boeing here. That is just one, though, of several options the Justice Department has in considering what to do. They have a July 7th deadline. And so this is the recommendation for prosecutors. We'll see what the Justice Department comes up with. A lawyer representing the families of those who died in the October 2018 crash. That was Lion Air in Indonesia, as well as the Ethiopian Airlines crash in Addis Ababa 5 months later in 2019. They say they have not received word yet from prosecutors about how they intend to proceed. Keep in mind here, the crash victims' families have not been so pleased with the lack of information they've been getting over the past few years. They were shocked and angered by the prosecutor's decision to allow Boeing to avoid criminal prosecution back in 2021. And because they were not considered crime victims at the time, prosecutors and Boeing negotiated the deal. They were not consulted, and they actually learned the news from media reports. Now, the relatives of the victims have subsequently sued and then won the right to have families considered crime victims here and pursue something against Boeing potentially. They actually sent a letter to the Justice Department earlier this month saying Boeing should face $25 billion with a B in additional fines, and the Justice Department should pursue aggressive criminal prosecution of the Boeing company. The feeling is that they let Boeing get off easy. But now it appears that even the deal that Boeing struck that would have prevented prosecution, there's a feeling they're not abiding by all of it. So that's a story we're going to watch closely. Jill, we told people last week about the Boeing CEO on Capitol Hill. Just it's hit after hit for Boeing. And we haven't even talked about the Alaska jet from January, the piece falling off. So there's just a lot going on right now, a lot of scrutiny for Boeing.
But this is why my reaction to that story last week, if you remember, was kind of shock, because having covered those crashes and the aftermath of those crashes, Boeing was supposed to make real fundamental changes to the way that it ran its business, as we just talked about, to oversight, to just its culture in general. And the fact that that hasn't been done is extremely disappointing, and particularly to the families of those more than 300 people who were killed.
Yeah, there have been more than 20 whistleblowers in the past few years that have come out. Jill, and that CEO who testified on Capitol Hill, Dave Calhoun, who's leaving at the end of this year, he was brought in 2020 specifically after those crashes to help fix things. And it appears, at least in the last few years, that whatever they've fixed has not been sufficient.
As we wait for final decisions on some major cases this week, the Supreme Court announced Monday that among the cases they're going to take up in the next term is a major one dealing with transgender rights. The court will be hearing a case on whether states can restrict medical treatments for transgender minors. It is a case that puts the justices in the middle of a charged national debate over gender identity. In a brief order on Monday, the court said that it would hear the Biden administration's challenge to a Tennessee law that bans gender transition care for kids. And that includes medications that can delay the onset of puberty and hormones that can cause physical changes, like the development of facial hair or breasts. Roughly 24 states have banned or restricted such treatments for minors, triggering legal battles around the country, with judges reaching conflicting conclusions on the validity of the measures. The Tennessee case will be the first time that the high court weighs in directly on the law's constitutionality.
Yeah, the important phrase there was conflicting conclusions. When multiple lower courts are reaching different decisions, that's when the Supreme Court says, it's time for us to intervene. So the court's next term begins in October. They typically hear the cases in the fall, and then we get the rulings in the spring. So the eventual ruling in this case probably happening around this time next year. It could be a landmark case when it comes to the scope of the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause, which guarantees people equal treatment under the law, and the decision could have a whole bunch of other impacts on other trans issues, including bathrooms for transgender individuals, sports teams, a lot of the stuff that's come up in the headlines and that states have been legislating around the last few years. So this Tennessee law is known as SB 1, and it prohibits doctors from providing certain treatments to anyone under 18, even with parental consent, if the procedure is used as part of transgender healthcare. The Republican Attorney General in the state saying the law protects children from unproven and risky treatments. Now, the Justice Department on the federal level is saying the Tennessee law here doesn't accord individuals equal treatment, contending that the ban is only for those who have what's called gender dysphoria, whereas the law does allow for these treatments to be used on kids that have delayed or precocious puberty. So if there's puberty issues and you're not changing gender, you can use some of these treatments. But if you're trying to switch genders, that's where the law comes into effect. And that's where the feds are saying, hey, wait a minute, that is not equal treatment under the law. And what's been interesting here, Jill, and we've been covering it here on the podcast and the newsletter on the Instagram account, is you have a whole bunch of red states, Republican states that have put bans in place. At the same time, you've had more than a dozen Democratic-led states that have adopted measures to protect transgender care. So a big impact here, as we've been seeing the court really take on a lot of really hot button, third rail issues the last few years: abortion, social media, Second Amendment, here taking on an issue that we have seen a lot of headlines on. So it'll probably be one of the most closely watched cases of the next term.
Time for the speed read from the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. We told you yesterday about the record rainfall and flooding in the upper Midwest in recent days, including Iowa and Minnesota. Well, now a dam just southwest of Minneapolis is in danger of completely failing after flooding of the Blue Earth River. It's prompting officials on Monday to warn the public public that the structure is, quote, in imminent failure condition. We posted video yesterday on Instagram showing water cutting around the sides of the dam, and debris has been accumulating in the water. The dam is located outside of the city of Mankato, about 85 miles southwest of Minneapolis.
Yeah, we're watching. The dam is called the Rapidan Dam here. The state has received roughly 18 inches of rain over the last few weeks, saturating the ground and leaving the water nowhere else to go. And there's potentially even more rain coming to the area. The result, if this dam completely fails, is flash flooding, damage to infrastructure, homes, farmland in this area. And this could risk the safety of people, hence the state of emergency, the calls for evacuations. And there's long-term issues in terms of the rapid release of sediment and debris in the Earth's ecosystem, harming fish and wildlife habitats. So a lot that we're watching here, Jill, in Minnesota, Iowa, and we'll keep you up to date on the Instagram feed.
From the Washington Post, at least 20 people, including a priest and over a dozen police officers, were killed in Islamic terror attacks in the Russian province of Dagestan on Sunday. A synagogue, an Orthodox church, and a police checkpoint were all targeted by the gunmen in a coordinated series of attacks. The attacks took place in both Dagestan's largest city and also the coastal city of Derbent. Now, for hours, the gunmen were on the loose, exchanging shots with law enforcement officials and setting fire to the church and the synagogue. 5 attackers were eventually killed. Russian state media reported that the attackers included relatives of a local official and a member of a prominent martial arts club.
Yeah, at the same time, people around Putin at the Kremlin have been trying to blame this on Ukraine and NATO. You saw the same thing when that major concert hall attack happened from ISIS. They don't want to admit that ISIS and Islamic extremists are operating inside Russia because Putin has made such a point of trying to defeat them over the course of the past decade. So in that case and in this case, without much evidence, they're like, well, this is totally Ukraine messing with us in Russia. But it does come at a time where we are seeing a series of acts from extremist Islamic militants across the country. As I mentioned, back in March, you had 4 gunmen killing 145 people at a concert hall near Moscow. It was an attack where ISIS claimed responsibility. And then back in Dagestan, in this province, a lynch mob searched for Jewish passengers on planes as they heard that a plane was arriving from Tel Aviv. You could see them storming the airport saying, "Where are the Jews? Where are the Jews?" This is that region, Dagestan, in southern, in the Caucasus region of Russia. Some background on Dagestan is a region that is 90 to 95% Muslim. About 2 million Muslims live there, 150,000 Christians, and then just 2,000 Jews. Actually used to be a much larger Jewish population. Many of them have left over the last couple decades. Still, one of the only synagogues left standing in the country, one of the targets of the attack on Sunday.
From Bloomberg, a follow-up to that major hack that we told you about last week that brought down thousands of car dealerships across the country. A hacking group called BlackSuit is behind the cyber attack on CDK Global, which is the company that helps more than 15,000 dealerships function every day and run many of their key processes like sales and repairs. The hack has partially paralyzed car sales across the country. The BlackSuit cybercrime group has demanded an extortion fee in the tens of millions of dollars from CDK, which reportedly plans to make the payment, according to Bloomberg News. BlackSuit named its extortion victims on a website, CDK not listed, which could mean that they continue to be in active talks.
Yeah, so some background here on BlackSuit. Like some of these other cybercrime gangs we've told you about, they appear to be a group of Russian and Eastern European hackers with a history of working with another group that is being tracked here called Roiled ransomware. Effectively what they do, and we've told you about what they do to hospitals, what they do to healthcare providers, what they do to schools, what they try to do to private companies, and in this case, the back end to car dealerships, is bring down their system and then demand a whole bunch of money, typically in Bitcoin, for them to bring the systems back online. Hence the term ransomware. They're demanding ransom for their activities. So they're called ransomware as a service gangs. And that's ultimately what they're doing. They're extorting these companies. And it appears that the way that they bring down these systems is so complex that companies like CDK and others are just like, just pay them so we can access their systems again.
It sets such a bad precedent. But at the same time, you understand why they're just like the path of least resistance here and the least expensive path.
Yeah, they're like, we know what you're costing you. Like, your systems are down. You're losing on a whole bunch of money. Pay us $20 million. We go away.
From the Associated Press, civil liberties groups filed a lawsuit Monday to block Louisiana's new law that requires the 10 Commandments to be displayed in every public school classroom, arguing that it violates the Constitution. Plaintiffs in the suit include parents of Louisiana public school children, represented by attorneys with the American Civil Liberties Union, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Under the legislation signed into law by Republican Governor Jeff Landry last week, all public K through 12 classrooms and state-funded universities will be required to display a poster-sized version of the 10 Commandments in, quote, large, easily readable font next year. Opponents argue that the law is a violation of separation of church and state and that the display will isolate students, especially those who are not Christian. Proponents say the measure is not solely religious, but that it has historical significance. In the language of the law, the 10 Commandments are, quote, foundational documents of our state and national government.
Yeah, that's the way Louisiana has been trying to get it protected, is like, it's not just about the Bible. It's the fact that the 10 Commandments were important to the nation's founders, though they are not quoted in the Constitution. They did come up in the various belief system of some of the founders. And so you have the Governor Landry in this case saying, bring it on. Literally, that's what he said. He's looking forward to this lawsuit. It was filed Monday and seeks a court declaration that the new law violates the First Amendment and should not be implemented. They want a court order immediately because right now the law says that the 10 Commandments needs to be up in every classroom by January of next year. This will be an interesting case to watch. Jill, it'll probably go through the system, and like we are always talking about, the Supreme Court may ultimately end up there. Because if you look at Supreme Court rulings over the last few decades, there was a case back in 1980 in Kentucky, almost pretty identical to this, where they tried to put up the 10 Commandments in classrooms. The Supreme Court at that time ruled against it. Then you have some more recent rulings. In 2005, the Supreme Court ruled that a display of the 10 Commandments at a pair of Kentucky courthouses also violated the Constitution. But then you had another case thereafter where they allowed the 10 Commandments to be displayed on the grounds of the Texas state capitol. And so those were 5-4 decisions by the slight majority conservative court. Interestingly, though, Breyer, a liberal, joined in that case that allowed the 10 Commandments at the Texas state capitol based on his rationale. So you should take a look at his concurring opinion from back then. That said, the court is 6-3 now. We'll see where they rule on this. And the advocates for this law think that things are going in their direction because you did have that recent ruling by the court that allowed that high school football coach to pray on the field. And they feel like that gives them an opening when it comes to church and state here, but still a case that we'll be closely following.
From CNN, as we've been reporting on food prices of late and some restaurants and fast food chains that have had to bring prices down in order to get customers in their doors again. And we're talking about ones that didn't go too far with price hikes. Business is apparently booming at Texas Roadhouse and Longhorn Steakhouse, even as Americans are pulling back in other places. In the early part of 2024, sales at company-owned Texas Roadhouse locations open at least 18 months jumped nearly 9% compared to the year before. And in the 3 months through May 26th, sales at Longhorn Steakhouse locations open at least 16 months rose about 4%. And it may not sound like a lot, but it's happening as Americans are really cutting retail spending and say that they plan to shell out less for summer vacations. Most restaurant chains are feeling the heat, with even McDonald's reporting that lower income consumers are pulling back. But these two eateries have a history of performing well during periods of economic uncertainty. A few years ago, the pair were standouts as inflation-weary Americans started to pull back on spending.
And the solution here sounds pretty simple, right? Cost is key. Giving people a feeling that they're getting a deal, an affordable luxury in this case. And when it comes to steakhouses, Texas Roadhouse and Longhorn Steakhouse are on the cheaper end. The average meal at Longhorn or Texas Roadhouse, very affordable compared to higher end steakhouses. So again, it gives people the feeling of affordable luxury. The average check per person at Longhorn is $26 a person. Texas Roadhouse is $22 a person. And so many restaurant chains hiked their prices since the pandemic, not only because of high costs, but because they realized diners would pay. And that has frustrated customers, and they're pushing back. Now you're seeing the short-term deals. We told you about McDonald's and some of the fast food folks last week. But in contrast, the folks at Longhorn and Texas Roadhouse made a point of keeping their prices relatively low, and it appears to have paid off in terms of their growth.
Look at that, Moshe. Make people feel like they're actually getting something for their money. It works.
We try to tell you the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to companies, consumers, and everything with this economy. We're going to start in 1950. On this day, North Korea unleashed its attack across the 38th parallel, after which the UN Security Council passed a resolution calling on UN members to assist South Korea. Just in the years preceding, in the aftermath of World War II, the Japanese invasion, etc., because the Soviets, where things ended at the end of World War II sort of drew the line. You saw that in Europe and you saw that in Asia. And so what was seen as temporary, which is like, let's just draw a line across the Koreas and figure it out later. Well, we know today where things stand. And so back in 1950, North Korea launches an attack, hoping to take the entire peninsula. The U.S. and others support South Korea. The war lasts 3 years. And in the summer of 53, 3 years later, basically ends where they started. The territory didn't really change that much despite all the deaths and destruction that took place in the war. They would sign an armistice, but of course no peace treaty exists to this day as we continue to talk about North Korea and all things Korea 74 years later. Fast forward to on this day in 1978, the first version of the rainbow flag representing LGBTQ pride was flown during the San Francisco Gay Freedom Day parade. So it was on this day in June 25th, 1978, that the creator of the flag, his name is Gilbert Baker, brought it out to the parade. And he says people were astounded by it. It was like a bolt of lightning that this was their flag. So this was his idea. He was a drag queen and clothing designer. And he's like, I want to make a flag for pride. So he creates the rainbow flag where each color represents a specific meaning. So violet for spirit, indigo for harmony, yellow for the sun, green for nature, red for life, pink for sexuality. There's a whole idea behind that rainbow flag. He brings it out and it explodes. He can't make enough. And of course, that's gone on to become a symbol. And of course, has evolved over time as more groups looking for representation have looked to be added onto that flag. All right, on this day in history, Jill, a day I remember very well, 2009, the king of pop, Michael Jackson, dies of cardiac arrest in LA at the age of 50. It was ruled that his death was a combination of a lethal combination of sedatives and propofol and anesthetic. And it was ruled a homicide in 2011. His doctor, Conrad Murray, was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter. Jill, that's happened to be my last day at Fox News. I was moving to a new job. I remember handing my BlackBerry in at the time on this day in 2009. And I remember seeing the headlines pop in the newsroom. And I was like, oh man, this is huge. I should help. And I remember helping for 30 minutes. I was like, wait a second, this is my last day here. I have a new job. I'm starting at Bloomberg in 2 weeks. But I remember for about a half an hour or 45 minutes, I was like, all right, I gotta help. I gotta find some videotapes. And it was funny. I was in the Washington bureau where we cover politics. So it was very hard to find videos of Michael Jackson in the DC bureau, but we were trying our best because at the time we were producing that hour out of Washington. So you had Brit Hume and a bunch of political reporters trying to talk about Michael Jackson's legacy. And then a few minutes in, the network calls from New York being like, we're going to take over the airwaves. You guys are struggling with this. And Shepard Smith takes over the coverage from New York with a better understanding of how to cover Michael Jackson's.
Well, your news instincts obviously kicked in. And one thing that people who are not in the news business may not realize is that most newsrooms have obits done for people that are aging, that are in advanced age, or maybe have a serious disease that they think might pass away.
Or they're very prominent, right? We always had one ready to go for presidents and anyone over a certain age or who's very sick.
But Michael Jackson, I don't believe, was on the list. That was one that took everybody by surprise. So there was not an obit ready to go. I mean, look, when I was at CBS Money Watch, I voiced the obit for Warren Buffett. It's just one of those things that newsrooms, who's still alive.
Who we should say he's still alive,
by the way. But it's one of those things that newsrooms think about all the time. They have departments and producers who are literally, that is their job, to get all of the obits ready and in good shape. That is their job, to get the obits ready. So that all of a sudden Michael Jackson, it was just such a shocking death. I was actually in the city at the time, and I was going to see a Broadway show with a friend of mine, and we were at a bar beforehand, and the bar just started blasting Michael Jackson and playing Michael Jackson because, of course, he had passed away, and totally surprising.
Yeah, crazy facts. Sometimes you read an obituary in a newspaper about someone who died, and the person who wrote the obituary also has passed away in recent years, because they prepare this stuff so long in advance that sometimes the author's already dead by the time that the piece is published about the person they wrote the obituary for. All right, sticking with music news, more uplifting music news. On this day in history, Prince released his 6th studio album, Purple Rain, on this day 40 years ago in 1984.
Which is why when I hopped on to do this podcast, I just heard Moshe humming to himself, Purple Rain. And I'm like, and I don't like to read ahead on this day. I like to wait until I like to hear it with the audience in real time. So I'm just like, why is he singing Purple Rain? It's all coming together.
In other music news releases on this day, young Jay-Z puts out his debut album. It's called Reasonable Doubt. You may not have heard it. It got some critical success, but not much commercial success. In fact, it's his worst performing album of all time, his debut album. But still, they saw some talent in that young Jay-Z, and Jill, he's figured it out. He's a billionaire now.
Yeah, I'm not worried about Jay-Z.
I'm not worried about the lack of people buying his initial debut album. He figured it out in subsequent albums. As far as debuts that did a bit better, Maroon 5, you may have heard of them. They released their debut album on this day, Songs About Jane. It came out on this day in 2002, so it turns 22 today. Among the songs on the album, Sunday Morning, This Love, Harder to Breathe. Pretty big debut by Maroon 5.
All right, everyone. A huge thanks for listening to the Mo News podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. It will help us grow. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
Bye.